Well, thanks for kicking off GDC week this way, everyone. I had a curiosity because I know this is a new topic for the games industry. How many of you have worked with actual blockchain tech before? Ethereum wallets, all that kind of, yeah, okay. And the rest, just free-to-play game developers or curious, roughly? Yeah. So I'm still waiting on slides for a moment. So my name's Brett Seyler. I've been in the game industry for about 15 years, mostly building technology and tools, initially at a company called Garage Games, which you guys are probably familiar with if you were building games during that era. Made a very affordable game engine technology in the early and mid-2000s called Torque. So I ran that business at Garage Games for a while. And then I was at Unity for several years, during its kind of initial growth over here, and reaching out to all the, I don't even know how many platforms it touches now. But I've also spent a lot of time looking at technologies that support the complexity that free-to-play game economies have introduced into the process of building and managing games. So the stuff that we sort of barely touched on at Garage Games, trying to operate browser-based games with a free-to-play model. Things like analytics, performance marketing, live management, CMS systems, server uptime, and things getting big on a global scale required like web scale services that were just not part of most game developers' core skill set. Let's see if I can. So yes, that's a bit of catch up on me. I've spent a lot of time on the server side recently, and quite a bit of time around game design, working closely with game studios, because really what I've always seen is technology occasionally unlocks design potential for games, but most of the time it's driven by what game designers want to do that the technology won't support yet, or it will, but it's very expensive or difficult to pull off, so only the best resource teams can take that on. And so this company that my co-founder Kevin Chu and I just recently announced in the last month, called Forte, we're building platform technology around blockchain technology. So basically the idea is to make blockchain really easy to use for game developers in the same way that most of the tooling, if you're operating games today, especially games as a service, you're probably working with very mature tech. It's easy enough for marketers and producers to use on occasion, and designers can get a long way in front end and authoring, and blockchain's not like that yet. Blockchain's pretty rough to work with for even very experienced developers. And there's end user experience improvements that everyone's aware of and really need to be resolved if games as an industry are going to adopt this stuff really broadly and make it part of game economies, which is our focus. So I'm not going to get too deep into the technology that we're building here because it's about 15 minutes talk, and what really I want to talk about is reasoning. This is more a talk that I hope will help some of you that are maybe skeptical, and I think really anybody that hasn't spent time really doing homework on the space should be skeptical. If you just read the headlines and you pay attention to the volatility and the speculation and some of the use cases, it looks pretty dubious. But what I'd like is to really try and steer as much of the game industry that's looking for new design potential and maybe frustrated by the stagnant state of especially free-to-play game design, to give this a look for purely design reasons. So that's kind of where I'm going to go with this. I'm going to get into what I think are really strong first principles for making good game design, game designs that entertain people for a very long time, a wide variety of people, and facilitate a lot of depth in the engagement with games. I'm going to try and map that to what I think blockchain offers the game industry now, and what we're going to try and build into. So, in short, this is how I got comfortable, how I learned to stop worrying and love blockchain. So This is actually a pretty old diagram here. This is Destiny in 2014. A game team I was working with did this is, in a very abbreviated detail, but a good example of a game that appears similar to games from 10 years ago, like Quake or even older on the surface, but under the hood, to manage a live experience that would span years for a global audience, needed to have a lot of complexity. You needed to have a lot of ways to make progress as a player. You need to have a lot of depth in just about every direction you want to head. And those are design decisions really intentionally created to keep players around, keep players interested, and some of that's depth of content, some of that's systems and refresh of systems, but the takeaway from this slide is players really want self-directed play. They really, the game designers aren't doing this because it's fun to manage game economies that are this complex. It's really hard. They're doing this because this is what players actually want. Players want to decide, do they like PvE modes, PvP modes? Do they want to quest? Do they want to manage economies? And they want to be able to make progress and be an equal and meaningful contributor inside these game ecosystems in their own chosen mode of progress. So that's really hard to accommodate as a game developer. But if you're building free-to-play game economies, where part of the appeal is you get a lot of users, you get global reach pretty quickly. They're going to be different users, and they're going to have different desires. And you, as the author of the game economy, and probably on behalf of a team operating an economy live, you have to try and anticipate all those demands far enough in advance that players don't hit dead ends or find themselves over-resourced or under-resourced or frustrated by the experience in some way. So it's created a really staggering challenge. And yeah, getting a little bit deeper into this, most games, the games that I think really do a great job of free-to-play game design, they really obscure a lot of this complexity, and you feel as a player that you have a lot of agency in the game, and that you're not really operating at what's under the hood. Models governed by databases and spreadsheets, and constantly refine data. Some game studios are even using machine learning to reduce some of the complexity or hand it over to silicon. But for the most part, you're still managing a huge task in trying to support a large free-to-play game economy. And how many of you guys know what these images are from? This is Venezuela this month. This is a lot of ketchup and other Heinz products. There's a law that store shelves must be stocked, but the government doesn't say with what. Where I'm leading with this is managing a game is easier than this, than running a national economy, but the way we're doing it is not the way that has proven best suited to running very complex economies. So this is a video, or a slide from a video that you guys can watch if you want. It's like 10 minutes on Khan Academy, but if you've taken Econ 101 ever in college, this is just a brief walkthrough of the difference between, this is really a spectrum of state-run, very command and control centralized economies where the state basically decides how resources are going to be allocated in a very, very big way, versus freer markets, which really don't exist in their pure ideal form, but again, there's a spectrum, and what we have seen over many, many decades now is freer markets tend to grow faster and produce better results than very heavy-handed, like command economies. But we're all running our games like command economies. We have to. That's really, it's very, very difficult not to, from a technology standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, and yet, what I'd argue is there are a lot of game designers that would like to operate games more like a free market, more like the way we're used to transacting in the real world, where you don't have a lot of we don't really spend a lot of time thinking about whether we're paying a fair price for the coffee we buy on the street, or the clothes that we're wearing, or whatever. We kind of offload a lot of that consideration to just an implicit trust in free markets and competition to give us something like a fair price. So that actually lets us manage a lot of complexity without having to burden ourselves with the real complexity under the hood of all the transacting we do every day. But again, game economies don't work this way. Game economies really ask you to consider almost every transaction that you make and offer you no comfort or sense that there are other people you can buy from than us, than the game developers. So we think just as a designer, this is pretty restrictive. There are games that offer marketplaces of some form. Usually they're very difficult to manage. Even like the best game developers out there, Blizzards and CCP, and there are a handful of people really trying to run freer markets in their game economies. But it's usually really difficult and very difficult not to be compromised, really difficult to resolve counterparty risk on behalf of players. And so what you often end up with is an expensive thing that only partially works. So yeah, this is jumping ahead a little bit. Again, Blizzard gives its players some mobility, some freedom to sell gold back into the treasury and take value from one game to another Blizzard game, but it really stops there. There's no further exit outside the game unless you operate in gray markets, which do exist and exist for a whole lot of games. And in my opinion, that's evidence that players really want more options. There's a dissonance to assuming the only way to get this thing is to buy it this way, when there's a whole bunch of people in the same mindset trying to figure out. We ask players to do their best job to figure out how to chase goals we create inside these games, and then we're frustrating the experience by trying to own and dictate all the complexity of these game economies. So. When we announced a few things a couple weeks ago, I threw up a few blogs kind of on this topic, and in general sense is, I've been around free-to-play and supporting free-to-play game economies with technology for quite a long time now, and I think one of the reasons why we've hit a real stagnation is free-to-play is not really free enough. It's not really, it doesn't parallel our experiences in the real world closely enough, where wading through the complexity of these really deep free-to-play game economies doesn't also burden us with this incredible cognitive load that really gets in the way of enjoying things and using, relying on your instincts and applying as a player your creativity to figure out how to chase the goal inside the game. So the challenges of trying to open these markets up a little bit, again, infrastructure expense, counterparty risk, really difficult to resolve in traditional tech architectures. There's, you really need all the financial middlemanning that we see today for the stuff that we did all in the real world, most of us still today, before blockchain. And I think we've got a way to go before we're all really transacting in that economy in real life too. But even once you get past that, you've got real new challenges compared to running free-to-play game economies in a different lens on the market, on the way you're looking at your economy. When you can't control all the transactions, when you can't even control entrances and exits, you can't set prices unilaterally, you end up looking at least part of your game economy or a system more in the way nations with central banks look at managing currencies. And this is what I think we're going to do as game developers long term. And it's hopefully going to be much easier than it sounds, because it's pretty damn hard for nations to do this. But we're going to have to slowly build our way toward making free-to-play games and game economies operate this way. And that's going to mean letting go of some of the control. And my assumption here, and I think it's pretty well reasoned, but I'd be curious to hear if anybody disagrees, is that I think this is going to result in faster growing and better game economies. I think it's actually going to do a better job of putting players and publishers on the same side of these economies, thinking about the value in these assets long term from at least closer to the same angle. So even if you're willing to take on the expense of all this and the challenge of managing an economy that's really more through the lens of looking at a treasury, and making markets around new goods or commodities or items that are created inside these games, you've still got compliance hurdles. And compliance hurdles right now are pretty expensive for any game developer to get past. They're time consuming. If you want to do it, if you want to conduct this kind of operation in your game economies today, well, you've really got to go chase money transmitter licenses in the States and their counterparts in Europe, and there's just it's a really complex, difficult patchwork to navigate just to feel like you're really operating within the intended bounds of the law. So that's usually too much for most, and I would argue blockchain gets us the first. Blockchain gives us a far better foundation to resolve counterparty risk and make it effectively a commodity in the long run. That is, not needing to know who you're transacting with to trust that the transaction or even computation in the long run will get done as intended. So the industry broadly, especially if game developers are going to use this, still has a lot of work to go to actually introducing this and managing this form of value flowing around inside your game economies in a way that's on par with the tools you're using right now and totally command free-to-play economies. So this is a big part of what we're building, and we put a fund together with our partner Ripple. So Ripple has two technologies that we really thought were outstanding solutions for interoperability and a hosting solution where games could run computation in a much more flexible way than is common today. So those two tools really put us on a path of tech alignment, and we put this fund together really to encourage third-party game developers to give this stuff a try with us. We're not suggesting that everyone jump into the deep end with both feet, although some people are going to be willing to do that, and there's business risk in it. But we think there's also an incremental and reasonably safe way to run some experiments alongside the kind of game economies you're all running right now, and to slowly free up these markets and build a path toward letting go of the reins, and that will, in the long run, outperform the way we run free-to-play game economies today. So this is kind of a survey of stuff that we're building in support of this mission. Sidechain technology that doesn't have its own native currency, can establish its own business rules, can adjust consensus rules based on what's at stake. Container-based hosting for everything you're going to need to run this stuff eventually in a decentralized way against open protocols. Smart contract framework that we've already done the hard work of security auditing and tried to establish, okay, people are going to want contracts to behave this way because they mirror very, very common systems used inside games, things like expiring use or exact use, or it's a host of stuff we probably haven't thought of yet, but trying to commoditize some of the cost and scariness of authoring your own contracts and letting them loose in the wild. And then a wallet that we think will offer a totally first-class, seamless experience inside games, separate from games as its own destination, if that's the intended use, but that will fold really seamlessly into the game views and resource management interfaces that you've already got in your games. And then APIs and data and sort of the ability to stand up a marketplace that's filtered by stuff that's specifically for your game or your collection of games. And we think these are the kind of right bones to start to tackle this stuff and put the industry as it is right now on a footing to adjust to this quickly but incrementally, not have to jump in with both feet and assume you got to run your entire game backend in live public networks. That's some of you are doing that right now, and kudos to you. But it's going to take a while, I think, for the industry to feel safe and comfortable doing anything like that. So, thank you. Any questions? I'm happy to take them.
Thank you very much. Great. Yes, so do we have questions from the audience? Anyone want to start? I will start if you don't. One thing, I really like this idea of this player empowerment concept. But as a designer, I'm kind of trying to work out how I would actually tackle that in terms of implementation. How have you kind of sort of found any initial hints?
One of the easiest, I think the light bulb for most of the game industry has already gone off on this. One of the easiest things is if you have any intention or desire to run a peer-to-peer marketplace, even with some rules, even with some limits, even with some oversight, it's going to be a lot easier to pull that off on blockchain tech than not. So that's like most game designers running, especially very social games that are long-lived, that's on a lot of designers' wish list, but it's very expensive.
I think it's also kind of a question. We've still got a AAA market that didn't realize how powerful it was having a secondary market for reselling their games, which empowered their ability to charge and also get more distribution.
Oftentimes the secondary markets are bigger in volume than the primary game economy.
So I think we've got some sort of communication challenges for developers to get them to understand it. Is there sort of any tips you'd give these guys about why this is the right way to go?
Well, the rabbit hole's pretty deep on this stuff. I think, I'm biased because I wrote them, but I did my best effort in this sequence of blogs to just describe how I got comfortable and convicted about using this stuff for the long term inside games, really from a pretty skeptical point of view to begin with. But if that alone is not convincing, I say go and do your homework and look at the many case studies of game developers with all the resources you could want, struggling to operate freer game economies, peer-to-peer marketplaces of any kind, trying to serve as market maker for in-game assets. It's incredibly difficult. Again, like Blizzard, everyone struggles with this, and it's that part is going to get technically easier, but operationally it's still going to be a challenge. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'm hugely convinced by all this, but then I've been through so many cycles where people said, no, it's never going to work, and it always ends up working. Just someone needs to lead the way. Thank you very much.
Okay.